Welcome to another edition of How to Fix It Yourself with Dave and Dave. Today we're going to be working on the 2001 Pathfinder. The issue we have is that the tensioner idlers are going bad on the car. You can start hearing them grumble and growl, so the bearings inside of those are going. So today we're going to replace those. We're going to go ahead and do a full replacement. About 70,000 miles ago, I did kind of a fix it myself type of a replacement by just replacing the bearings. But this time I'm going to replace it with a factory part, just because it's getting to that point where it needs to be totally rebuilt properly with the proper parts. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I think you'll find it very useful and helpful. Again, this is one of those things that can be helpful on many cars. Now, just as a caution, or just as a piece of information, many cars, especially American cars, will have a spring tensioner. A lot of foreign cars will have a idler that you have to manually adjust, and it'll have some kind of an adjustment screw or a method of rocking it and tightening a bolt to get it tensioned properly. Now, this particular one that we have from Nissan has a tensioner screw to put the tension on the belt. So we've got to loosen the screw, and then we've got to take off a complete bracket. But we'll show you how that goes. And let me grab the part real quick and we'll take a look at the part. All right, so this is what the part looks like that we're going to be putting in. And so it sits in a bracket, and at the bottom of the bracket, this tensioner screw goes. And so as you run the screw, it pushes this up and down to put tension on the belt. And so this whole assembly is going to get replaced in the positioning bracket that's mounted on the engine. So that's the program we're going to do today. Again, many cars have the same sort of tensioner system, so this will at least help give you an idea of how to do a full replacement on your tensioner. So the tensioner on the driver's side, which is for the air conditioner compressor, is this one right here. So this is one we're going to be replacing right there. Yeah, and so this is the other one we're going to replace, which takes care of the power steering and the alternator. So those are the two that we're going to replace today. We need to get on this bolt, on this nut right there, and loosen it. So now you can see that we've got it loose. And once we have it loose, so the first thing we need to do is we need to loosen up the tensioner. And once you kind of get the start on it, it actually works pretty well because the belt is helping to push that down. So we just need to get that loosened up. Go ahead and work it down. And once we have it loose, then we go ahead and get on the tensioner and start taking the tension off of. That's all we need to do there. Just take that on down. And at that point now, it's easy to go ahead and get the belt loose. Now it won't come loose till we do the same thing on the other side. So we need to get on this bolt, on this nut right there, and loosen it. So now you can see that we've got it loose. And once we have it loose, then we go ahead and get on the tensioner and start taking the tension off of that. Okay, so once we have that all loose, there we go. Okay, so now the belts are off, and now we can take them off from the top. All right, so we'll take the belts off next. Come on. All right, there's belt number one off, and belt number two just drops right down through there. All right, So now we've got the belts off. You now can see a little easier how this whole assembly fits together right there. So on this side we need to take this bolt now. It's not this top bolt, it's this bolt here. And there's another bolt down below it. So it's that middle bolt that you need to take off in order to drop this bracket assembly off of there. And then there's one on the bottom you need to take off too, and then you can take the whole assembly out. And then you need to, on this side, you need to take this top bolt off right there, and then you need to take the bottom bolt off, and then that entire bracket will come out. All right, so we've already taken off the brackets. We had to loosen this bolt to get the slide adjustment to move down so we could get the belt off. So it's already loose, but you know, if it's still tight, you can take a wrench. It's a number 14, or it's a 14 metric, and get that loose. Now we left the wheel on here. It made it more complicated in taking this off, but we wanted to show you the detail on putting this back together again. Now I said there was 2 bolts, but actually as you can see there's actually 3 bolts, and there's 3 bolts on the other bracket that we'll show you here in a minute. Additionally, on this one on the driver's side, you'll notice that there was also a clamp that held a couple of the wires and another one that held a couple of other wires. Now this one was a zip tie, and as you can see we broke that off, but we'll put a new zip tie in there when we put it back together again. And this is just a 10 millimeter bolt that goes up here that holds that piece in place there. So we'll go ahead and show you how this all comes together now. Now in order to make sure this thing slides, of course, the pulley system cannot actually contact the bracket. And so there's some spacers that go in here that are very important. So you can see there's this spacer here, which holds this shield on, which goes up against the bearing. And then you've got your wheel, which comes off. And then you've got another spacer with a shield on the back side, which keeps it from contacting this and allows it to tighten up against this flange area once you get it set in place. So you'll need to take the old tensioner off because the new one, or the tensioner bolt off, because the new one has one on. You'll notice there's a lip here to keep it in place so that when you push the tensioner up, it actually has something to work against. You'll also notice that it has a L on it for being on the driver's side, so the left-hand side. So it comes out easy. You might have to rotate it down a little bit, but then it comes out, and you've got the 2 lips up here to hold that in place so that it doesn't come loose once it's on the vehicle. So that's how it comes apart. We've kind of cleaned it a little bit. We'll probably clean it a little more. But all of these parts here now are waste, and you can just get rid of them. Now we're replacing it with a genuine Nissan part. You'll notice that there is a bit of a difference between the genuine Nissan part and this. This was a generic roller that I put in about 60,000 miles ago. And you'll notice that you have access to be able to press the bearing out and replace just the bearing if you want. So if you're really trying to save money, you can certainly go that route. But I've had better luck with the actual Nissan parts than with the generic. So that's why this time we're going to go ahead and put it back together again with the genuine Nissan parts. So this is the bracket for the passenger side, or the right-hand side. Again, it has a holder down here to keep the tensioner bolt in place. You'll notice that it also has 3 bolts on this one as well. This particular bolt is really a pain to get to, although both of these are really a pain to get to. You just have to work at it, use whatever tools you can, and just kind of get your hands down in there and whatever you've got to work on it. But you just have to be patient and just continue to push at it, and you'll eventually get it off. So this is the passenger side bracket. So we're going to actually put when we put this back together again, it's actually easier to get at all these bolts if you don't have the entire assembly in there. So you can get around these parts if you don't. So what I recommend you do and I'm going to use the old part just for show and tell. So what I recommend you do is on this particular one, just go ahead and slide this back into place, because you don't have room to put that in after you put the bracket in. But go ahead and leave the rest of the parts off, and that makes it a lot easier to get to all the bolts. And then once you get to all the bolts, you'll want to reassemble your idler on the car once it's there. And that's fairly easy to do, because you're slipping just on all the spacers and everything. Be sure you watch how the spacers come off of the part. You're just going to assemble all the spacers and get it put back together again on the vehicle, and that makes it a lot easier to get to your bolts. We're going to get ready to put this one in place. So you want to take and remove the nut, and watch the order in which this goes in. So there's the nut, there's the first spacer plate, there's the thick spacer washer, then we have the roller assembly, then we have another spacer washer, and the final protector. So we now have it in the right order, so we know after we put it on the car how we're going to put that together again. So I punched out the part of the zip tie that broke off, so now it's open. You can go down to the hardware store and buy zip ties with little Christmas trees, I call them Christmas trees, on them to replace it. Or you can just go ahead and use a small zip tie and just thread it through there and just tie it to that. That's all that's needed. You don't really need to have the Christmas tree. It just makes it a little easier. If it comes out for you, great, then you don't have to worry about it. So we're going to go ahead and just go from there, and we'll use a regular zip tie to put that all together again. All right, so now we're ready to go put this on the car. And we'll go ahead and do this one first, and then we'll go driver's side first, and then we'll do the passenger side after that. We've put the driver's side plate back on, and we haven't torqued the bolts yet, but that's what we're going to do next, is get the bolts nice and tight. We've left the tensioner wheel off, and this time you can see that it's much easier to deal with the bolts with the tensioner wheel off. Now, we left it on because we wanted to show you the sequence of it coming apart. And yeah, I suppose we could have taken it apart properly and pulled the bolts and then put it all back together again on the table to show you how the parts come apart. But that's what we chose to do. But clearly you can see that it's a lot easier to get at all your bolts with the wheels off. So we're now going to torque down the bolts, and then we'll put the driver's side tensioner wheel back on, and then we'll go ahead and do the passenger side after that. All right, so we first put on the shield, and then we put on the spacer, and then we put on the roller. That's where it gets a little bit tricky, because you've got to be able to get that to go onto the shaft. There it goes. Now we put on the next spacer. Again, you have to kind of make sure you keep things pulled together. Then the shield, and then the nut goes on. Okay, finger tighten it, then make sure it spins freely, and then we can go ahead and torque it down. Okay, so I torqued the bolt down on the pulley to make sure that it still ran free, and I showed you that it ran free. So now we're going to loosen it up, because remember, it's got to be loose in order for it to slide up and down and tension the belt. So you don't want it real loose, but you want it loose enough to where it'll slide up and down, so you can torque up the tension up the belt. So just have it finger tight so you can make it go up and down. All right, so we can now put on the belt and tension that side. So on the driver's side, you can kind of get away without having to do something to hold the spindle in place. On this side, it's a lot more difficult, so I'm going to use a sacrificial zip tie. We're going to hold it in place with a zip tie till we get this bolted into the vehicle. So that'll keep us from having to fight with this while we're trying to get the bolts all lined up and get the bolts put in. So now we're going to put the outside spacer on. And we're going to put the shield on. And now we're going to get the bolt on. Again, after you get it all snug down, you want to make sure that it spins freely. All right. So we're good. And we've got slide, so we can now put the belts on and tighten it all up. So now that we've got the pulleys all on, we showed you an easier way to do it by pulling the pulleys off when you take the brackets off. We're now going to, we put them back on, we've got the pulleys on. So before we tighten everything up, we've got to put the fan belts on. Now clearly, if you're not replacing the pulleys, this is just how you replace the fan belts. You loosen up the outer nut on the pulley, then you do the adjustment screw to loosen it up and bring it down so you have some slack in your fan belt, and then you take the old fan belt off and put the new one on. So we're going to go ahead and put the new ones on. Clearly, if you're replacing your tensioners, you're going to want to put on brand new belts at the same time. It only makes sense. The way you determine when it's tight enough is what your deflection is on this point in the belt and on this point on this belt. And so we need to tighten those up and start looking for it. You want about a 1/16 of an inch deflection, 1/8 to a 1/16 of an inch deflection on the belts. And so we're going to start tightening them up, and unfortunately, yeah, you've got to get underneath and then on top, underneath and then on top, just to hone in on it. So we're going to start tightening up the bolt, and we'll start working back and forth. So we just get on the bolt and start turning it, start getting some tension on it. You can feel it starting to tighten up, and as it gets to where you think it might be close, just go ahead and take a break. So I've got it where I'm close. I'd like it just a touch tighter, but you can see how I'm really minimized the deflection. So we're going to go ahead and do one more crank or two, check this one, then we'll get the other belt and see if we can then start the engine and make sure that everything's good after it's run for just a little bit. Please be sure to tighten up the bolt on the pulley before you drive the car. It's okay to let it idle for a little bit like this, but don't run the car without being sure that center bolt is tight. So go ahead and work on the tightening. I got it where I think it's about right. I've just checked the belt. It's still just a little bit loose. So you go back and forth on both of them until you get it about right. Now, kind of snug up the center bolt a little bit, but not too much. Then start the engine and let it run so that the belts get a little bit exercised and make sure they're all setting in all the grooves. And then after that, go ahead and do any last minute tensioning you need to do, tighten up the bolts, and you've got it done. So if you start it up and it squeals, like just happened to us, it tells you that it's not quite tight enough. And these belts loosen up pretty quick. So tighten it up, make sure you've got the right tension, make sure nothing's squealing, and then be sure and tighten up the bolt on the idler bearing itself.